Sanctuary is about care. Its synonyms include almshouse, asylum, hospice, hospital. Sanctuary prescribes any word providing care for people who are poor, sick, disabled or mentally ill, for contrite felons, refugee aliens, all in need of refuge, and care, compassion. For over 1,000 years, legal sanctuary was divine and absolute. Any person who willfully abused its law, peasant or king, was subject to severe penalty. Medieval sanctuary in Britain converted Saxon wood to Norman stone, and its abbeys, churches, cathedrals and monasteries owned sanctuary privileges. And so too its legion of charities and hospital almshouses, then protected by law, church law. Not till the early 18th century was legal sanctuary repealed, and poorhouses legally converted to workhouses, sanctioned by King's law. But sanctuary spirit remained, and by the end of the 18th century, the word asylum again benignly identified caring places, albeit with poor facilities, climate of the times. After witchcraft law was repealed, mental illness became a sad subject of media entertainment, often by black satire. Its sufferers and carers treated with disdain, in fear, ignorance, and sometimes bleak inhumanity. Sadly, to this day, some media reflect this negative Gothic approach, be it literary, in children's comics, in film or other press, giving myth as fact to all. But that is not a true history of care. Fortunately, over centuries, people have cared and continue to do so. And asylum institutions, whatever paucity of resources or hostile public attitudes prevailed, provided care at all levels. In those benign places, staff and residents, where possible, shared numerous responsibilities towards their more unfortunate sick and unable charges. Doctors, nurses, tradesmen took on other additional tasks as firemen, bandsmen, farm labourers, or as entertainers. But most noticeable, they displayed constant evidence of compassion, a common community spirit, caring for their more unfortunate brethren. An abundance of past and present recorded evidence continues to be provided, demonstrating a social history replete in this field of hospital care. Graylingwell Hospital, Chichester, has existed for 100 years and is an excellent example of a long-stay caring institution. St Mary's Hospital was established in 1171 AD as a wayfarers' hospital, later as an almshouse in Chichester, West Sussex. Inside St Mary's, there is a chapel at the end of the nave, and the almshouse rooms are situated either side, which allowed residents to have easy access. This was one of the 3 medieval hospitals. Second was the leper hospital. In Chichester there were 4 leper hospitals. One, St James Hospital, was founded in 1171 AD. These were mandatory hospitals for infectious diseases. At the end of the 17th century, St James residents included physically disabled and mentally ill. All medieval churches and hospitals' chapels were sanctuaries protected by law. So St James would have been protected by the Cathedral See of Chichester. The third type of medieval hospital would later lead to the poorhouse. Corley's almshouse, known as St Bartholomew's Hospital, was taken over by a local Chichester parish, St Peter the Great, and later became a poorhouse, the workhouse, in the 18th century. Workhouses had their lunatic cells. The Poor Law Act of 1601 was formed in Henry VIII's time, when abbeys and monasteries were broken and dissolved. Thousands of people were released onto the streets. Many poorhouses were erected to take the respectable poor. This picture is of George IV in 1829. It parodied a local parish overseer holding the parish purse in one hand and the stick of authority of the beadle in the other. The overseer, with church wardens, was then the only legal person responsible for looking after the sick poor. In 1834, a Poor Law Amendment Act was passed and assistant overseers called relieving officers were appointed. Social duties were looking after the poor, sick, disabled, and mentally ill. A huge job which didn't recede until as late as 1948, when they were renamed social workers. In 1845, all counties had to provide a public asylum. In the 18th and 19th century, private madhouses grew up alongside parish workhouses. Graylingwell Hospital opened to receive patients in 1897, after the Local Authority Act of 1888 took control from local parish vestries to form a new county council, and Graylingwell records commenced. Its first medical superintendent was Dr. Harold Kidd. The local well-wisher hospital magazine, Graylingwell, Christmas edition 1965, said, "Graylingwell was a great family, with a staff which had strong bonds and mutual affection, giving their lives to the care of the patients. There is a happy relationship between patients and staff." This exemplifies the hospital's duty of care to its extended family. Historically, the hospital grounds go back at least to Roman times in occupation. There are entrenchments across Havenstoke Park from St. Martin's Farm, indicating Roman and Belgic occupations in 43 AD, Saxon, then medieval occupation, hunting across the fields of Graylingwell when it was a royal warren. Chichester Ecclesiastical Authority owned the land from medieval times until the 1850s. Graylingwell Manor Farm was then rented out, but purchased by the new West Sussex County Council after the 1888 Local Authority Act for the new West Sussex County Asylum, and the 1890 Lunacy Act was introduced. Dr. Harold Kidd's appointment was in 1896, and his records began. This was one of the first books of the new asylum. In 1894, this record predated by 3 years the opening of the asylum itself. Patients already on the books who would be entering West Sussex Asylum on its completion. In 1897, the asylum formally opened with 450 beds. Dr. Kidd and the staff referred to it as the Graylingwell Hospital in 1898. The estate included 2 farms, an isolation hospital, and its own detached chapel. See the view of landscape from the south, the farm road entrance. Railings contained the hospital farm livestock, church, administrative and workshop buildings. The superintendent's house is on the right. The Bishop of Chichester led the dedication of the church sanctuary, accompanied by the new hospital chaplain. Graylingwell Farmhouse was built in the 17th century. In the mid-1850s, a Quaker banker and his family, the Sewells, rented the farmhouse. Anna Sewell was the well-known author of Black Beauty. Around the farm were a number of wells. To the right of this building was the Grayling Well and Pond. Another obligatory building was the sanatorium, to be called Sandown. It was used for many years for GPIs and children and women who suffered from TB. It would eventually be used for recovering alcoholics in a therapeutic community in the 1960s. It closed down in the 1980s. At the turn of the century, there were 2 new extensions, a female block and a male block, Edgeworth and Eastergate. This is a group of satisfied workmen. The Boer War removed a lot of staff in the hospital at this time. And what about the patients? Early 1890s, when the new patients arrived, they had their photographs taken for their folios, each signed by Dr. Harold Kidd. The corduroy suit, you see, was made on the wards. There was purposeful occupation for able-bodied residents who were capable. Notice the lace on this dress. Female patients, too, were found occupation in the laundry and other buildings. Men worked as tailors, carpenters, painters, etc. And in Graylingwell from the outset, patients did get little extras, pots of jam or tobacco and tokens, as late as the 1940s. What about treatment? In the 1890s, there were few drugs. This straight waistcoat, Graylingwell had its stock of these, was kept in a cupboard, but never used. Seclusion pads were introduced in the 1840s. People sometimes, through illness, lost complete control and, damaging themselves, needed a quiet room, a place of safety. Graylingwell pads closed down in the late 1960s. The fabric was soft, padded with horsehair and leather, black or green. There was a social life too, and the staff greatly contributed to this. This football team in 1904, Mr. Peacock, farm bailiff, was one of the team. Most of the others were nursing attendants. Dr. Kidd and medical staff also participated in sport. This was the Grayling Well pond, taken about 1915. The pond was eventually taken out in the early 1960s. Grayling Well became a war hospital in 1915 until 1920, during which time several photographers were called in and numerous postcards were made showing the hospital and its grounds. It was a bastion of good care. Grayling Well and 15 other British hospitals were closed for new war casualties. From 1915 to 1920, all patients were transferred out of Grayling Well. By 1920, Dr. Kidd, now Colonel Kidd, was living with his family in the hospital grounds. This is one of the wartime wards with verandas. Beds were placed in the open air to encourage recovery and convalescence. All wards were named Kings, if male side, or Queens, if located on the female side. Here is a probation nurse who had served in HM forces. Henry George Clinch, taken in 1921, he was a psychiatric nurse. Probationers were then called male attendants. You were proud to wear the uniform. Whistles were for safety. Female staff, 1920, on grounds which later became known as the Social Club of Graylingwell, which for years were tennis courts. Top left is Vera Lewington. She was 20 before she was eligible to train as a nurse. Vera qualified after examination and was awarded her medal and certificate from the MPA, Medico-Psychological Association, and the certificate was signed by Superintendent Kidd. In 1925, the first year of the General Nursing Council. At that time, if a male nurse met a female nurse and they decided they wanted to get married, one of them would have to leave. And if they both worked in the hospital, it was usually the female who was asked to leave. All staff had to exercise regular fire drill. Female staff too had to participate. Here are the male attendants at fire drill, dressed in serge uniforms. This 1920 picture was taken from the water tower. See the carriage on the north roadway. There is the Royal Military Police Barracks, taboo to nurses in those days. New brick buildings went up in 1933, following the 1930 Mental Treatment Act. In World War I, numerous male staff were drafted, making staff shortage. A critical book by Dr. Lomax in 1921 was instrumental in raising tremendous public protest to reform the asylums. The 1930 Mental Treatment Act was one dramatic major result. No iron railings for new buildings, and patients would have individual clothing. The new villas were Summersdale, Kingsmead and Richmond. On the right is Pinewood, the female nurse's home. The 1930 Act recognized that patients, if possible, could come in without compulsory certification to Summersdale Villa, but not to the main building. In the Worthing community, new outpatients clinics begun in 1931. These sheep are in Summersdale Field grounds. The chap with the white fuzzy beard is a hospital shepherd, taken sometime in the 1920s. He was working on the hospital farm. Here, patients and staff are harvesting together and potato picking in a huge field. Patients were given small rewards. One can see immense hospital vegetable and fruit gardens. This was pre-1930. Note the cultivated gardens. There were cattle and livestock. Visible, the superintendent's house and the tower, church and Sandown, the isolation hospital and farmhouse. Cecil Green here, driving the tractor, and his colleague Fred Twine on the grass cutter are outside the new Kingsmead building. Cecil came to work in Graylingwell early 1930s. The Green family was brought up on the hospital farm. Ronald Green had decided to move up from the West Country and in late 1939 was employed as the Graylingwell shepherd with 500 sheep. This photograph was later taken about 1948. All three of Ronald Green's girls became registered mental nurses in Graylingwell. The era of the National Health Service had begun, and they were already part of it. This picture, taken in the 1980s, was the head stockman's cottage, now boarded up. In this picture, taken about 1949, Ronald Green was now a hospital stockman who looked after cattle and worked in the dairy. He would later again become a cook in the cookhouse of the main building, where he would remain until his retirement in the 1960s. The farm grounds had extended, the grounds well cultivated. Les Dicker went to work in this hospital in 1919 as a dispensary boy and retired as a head nurse. He recalled when he started, all trees had their own flower beds around each root, tended by patients. This picture of the farm shows the barn. That's the farmyard, a pig farm with tiers of piggeries, the gardening house and chicken houses. There are the gardens where the potato pickers were, and the barn is where vegetables were prepared and later sold or distributed to the main hospital building. There was a real community at Graylingwell. Here, 4 prize pigs are on sale at the Chichester market. Cecil Green, 20 more years on. The hospital's farm foreman, this is one of the last photographs we have of the Chichester farm with Graylingwell stock. The farm closed down in 1957, a new form of therapy coming in called industrial therapy, along with occupational therapy, which would convert all the farm buildings to a new purpose. A new form of care was coming into being called rehabilitation, which had been around since the early 1930s. Other activities, football and cricket, staff and patients' dances, hospital excursions in the 1950s. The gentleman with glasses is Dr. Joshua Cass, who was the last of the medical superintendents, was an advocate of rehabilitation. Dr. Colonel Kidd, the superintendent from 1896 to 1926, was replaced by Dr. Ainsworth from 1926 to 1938, and Dr. Joshua Cass, who you see amongst staff at an athletic meeting in the grounds, was superintendent from 1938 to 1963. More clinical treatments. In the 1940s was leucotomy. In the Second World War and post-war years, the hospital beds swelled with numerous new patients, and a neurological brain operation called leucotomy was introduced. Here is one of the Graylingwell's records after leucotomy. Some patients would be discharged, others lived a better quality of life in care. These records in the archives disclosed how much attention was given to leucotomies, which were practiced in Graylingwell. It was a physical treatment, which was very much the focus in those wartime and post-war years. Psychiatry attempted as a branch of general medicine. Insulin treatments were used in the 1950s. It was found that patients with depression especially benefited. Insulin treatment went out of fashion. It took too much time. There were too many risks, and it was not economical. A modified insulin did exist for a while in tandem with ECT. In 1938, a new clinical treatment was introduced at Summersdale and later Amberley 1 ward. In wartime and early post-war years, prolonged narcosis treatment was used. A number of other physical treatments for the mentally ill were tried, and a new physical clinical treatment from the 1940s came into the hospital. Electroshock therapy in the 1940s and 50s. A minute shock was given, controlled low voltage, which for whatever unknown reason, when activated, brought a person out of a disturbed state of mind. EST, or electroshock therapy, did not have scoline to begin with to relax muscles, and in those early days an incident was recorded of somebody damaging their back. There was then a risk, but when scoline was brought in, this problem disappeared. It did very little for schizophrenia, for which it was first designed, but for depression it really was effective. Physical treatments are still looked at as a possibility with other alternatives, psychotherapy and psychology. Talking therapies are also supportive and helpful to many patients. Here in the 1950s is a psychologist conducting a test, the Rorschach butterfly. Psychology developed in the post-war period out of the MRC, Medical Research Council unit, as one way ahead for the benefit of mentally ill. Long stay back wards in the 50s and 60s were overcrowded, with 50 to 60 and more beds due to a common paucity of staff and accommodation. New policies were introduced. Rehabilitation programs of the 60s and 70s and special daycare facilities outside the hospital were coming in, and the size of the hospital population was then reducing. Mr. George Clinch on Amberley 1 admission ward, deputy head male nurse from 1938 to the early 60s. In the rear room, a billiards table. Television appeared from 1953 onwards. A fairly typical view of a male ward in the main hospital. Summersdale Villa. Cicely Green, who you saw earlier as one of the Green family children, is here in this photograph about 1954, enjoying the sunshine out on the veranda during the summer weather. Summersdale wards were not seen as the hospital, but experienced as the neurotic or a day hospital. Chemotherapy. Charge nurse Stevenson, measuring Largactil, a liquid medication which came into prominence in the 50s and early 60s as one of the major tranquilizers. Dr. Capstick, who as a consultant psychiatrist in those years for rehabilitation, some years later recalled vividly how greatly advantageous those particular drugs were. They helped reduce symptoms of patients who could then cope with medication in the community or be coped with by others. The Mental Health Act of 1959 had been passed. Mental welfare officers, social workers, were introduced at that time, still under the Health Authority. In the 1970s, they transferred to the social services. Changes were taking place, and the hospital was shrinking. An exhibition was held in Worthing and in Chichester in order to raise staff. Dr. Brian Vaudrey, consultant psychiatrist, worked at Grailingwell from 1954. This picture was taken in the 1960s. At the back of Summersdale Villa were two post-war training school buildings, later an art therapy unit for rehabilitation. Here are a group of student nurses with central Miss Nash, RMN, nursing tutor. This picture was taken about 1957. The hospital was proud of its training courses and the Grailingwell Hospital badge. Nurses had two qualifications, one from the local hospital and the GNC, General Nursing Qualification. The new Grailingwell Social Club in 1957. Tom Hale, RMN, and his wife, on the right, Shirley. Purpose-built OT Nissen huts were built in the early 50s. First opened in 1952. Training at that time included painting, carpentry, crafts and industries. Goodwood toys were made in this OT section in the 60s. OT and IT to continue into the 80s. The OT Nissen huts were sadly destroyed as a result of the hurricane winds of 1987. Modern occupational therapy had evolved following shell shock treatment in the First World War and professionally from the 1930s. In Grailingwell, 1931, the first OT-trained nurse was employed, and social workers by 1938 within the hospital. The Naunton Pavilion was opened for patients' refreshments in 1965 by the Duke of Richmond and Gordon. The building itself was one of the last of bricks and mortar before Barnfield, the mentally handicapped unit, was constructed some years later. Community care with rehabilitation was underway. This building was the Acres in Worthing in the 1950s. Grailingwell then had over 1,500 patients. By the 50s, rehabilitation was a result first of the Mental Treatment Act in the 1930s, but not able to get started until post-war years. Dr. Joshua Cass, expanding early rehabilitation programs at Grailingwell, realized that many patients wanted to go out into the community. Something more permanent had to be done. Worthing presented two buildings known as the Acres or the Acre, as a unit for local patients due early rehabilitation discharge. Staff slept on the premises. The Worthing experiment, which was a community care project in 57 and 58, providing a day hospital for both male and female outpatients. A success. A 7-day service experiment for 2 years, working closely with GPs, 2 social workers, nursing and medical staff. Dr. Panton, a consultant psychiatrist who used to take patients for rambles over the Downs, was based at the Acre in Worthing, here with 2 social workers. The hospital printing department, just one of the many places patients worked in. It closed altogether in the 1980s. The hospital much reduced, and here is the Grayling Well. The hospital grounds much damaged by the hurricane winds in 1987. In the foreground of the remains is a large gate which was made by patients. In the back was a mural, also designed by a patient. Underneath the gate is the well itself, now buried. The elements at work. We are now into the 80s. Community care is national policy. New laws, 1983 Mental Health Act and 1990 Community Care Act, now instrumented. For over a decade, there was continued development of a huge range of activities, parties, evening socials and sport activities, together with the development of industrial and craft workshops. The move towards the community was actively pursued with the continued success of industrial therapy, the establishment in the old farmyard of community bridge-building projects, and continuing development of woodwork and gardening. Regular visits for interest, maintenance of confidence and coping with life outside the hospital were arranged using a hospital minibus. Sport and physical activity was still important, although the big inter-hospital events had ceased. Badminton, swimming and walking were still possible. Self-care in all aspects was important. The Red Cross manicures, the domestic training unit, and the social and spiritual welfare of shared lunches and services, such as the Harvest Thanksgiving. Similarly, community care resources, day care, admission units, community psychiatric nurses, OTs and other professionals and auxiliaries are now based in the community, be it Bognor, Chichester, Horsham, Midhurst, Worthing, and private agencies working in partnership. The parent hospital size was further reduced as this community care was developed. The continuing theme of the asylum and sanctuary care that these hospitals gave in their time ensured patients received good care at Grayling Well, a model in its time. Taken May 1994. Barry Hopper is seated in front of the main entrance with Mr. Gerald LeBlount Kidd, who was the son of the first medical superintendent, Dr. Harold A. Kidd. Between him and his father, who retired in 1926 and previously appointed in 1896, we may compass the entire hospital's history, 100 years until the late 1990s, a duty to care for thousands of patients, sanctuary care.